Okay, so today we're going to look at sort of two different topics, but generally linked. The first will be briefly a kind of review of the function of the state for Marx, the origin and the function of the state. And then we're going to look at the question of the revolutionary transformation of society. What is socialism? How could it come about according to Marx? Okay, so for the first part, partially review, but again, we'll raise a couple new points. So the function of the state, just to start out, the function of the state for Marx is as an instrument. So it's an instrument for who, for what? It's an instrument for the ruling class. And, so far, the ruling class that we've talked about has always been a minority. And thus it has been an instrument for the state, that is, has been an instrument for a minority to rule over a majority. But of course, at the expense of that majority, that is, in opposition to it. And so a state, a government, a state, is an instrument of class rule, and it is necessary, and it is the primary means that this minority is able to exert its rule over a society. And its primary mechanism for carrying this out is through violence. Now, the vast majority of human existence, of course, as we discussed, existed prior to class divisions in roughly egalitarian, primarily foraging societies. In these, there is no private property over what we would call the means of subsistence or survival. That is, there's no subgroup within society that had some kind of power over people's lives as a whole. Couldn't impose decisions upon them and so on. And without society being divided fundamentally into antagonistic classes, therefore the need for a state, this instrument of class rule, did not arise. We could say, without classes, well, then we don't see an instrument for class rule or an instrument to maintain class division. The need for it doesn't arise. Once human beings began, as we discussed, to cultivate agriculture, that new possibility emerged. What new possibility? That is the possibility for a surplus to emerge, where two hands, when applied, for example, to agricultural food production, could begin to feed dozens of mouths. So now there's a possibility for a subgroup of society to control that surplus and put it at their own interests and not the interests of the whole society. And if so, well then, this small subgroup, that is a minority, is going to need some sort of instrument to impose its rule over the other. Hence, the need for a state emerges once you have that class division. But of course, as I mentioned in previous discussions, just because the possibility of an agricultural surplus arises, that doesn't mean that societies collapsed immediately into division. There were many agricultural or pastoral societies that were able to maintain their surplus and not develop into class division. Some of them were made of the indigenous in the Americas. Agricultural societies or semi-agricultural societies that did produce surpluses, but of course did not devolve into some sort of class division. Overall, this just meant that there was, what it meant when you had this surplus was just that there was less work for the group as a whole, and they're able to devote more of their lives to, enjoyment, crafts, music, etc. That's all the surplus really meant. But eventually, as we've gone over, in some places a ruling class does emerge, that is, in those places where class division emerges, and the ruling class owned the surplus and subjected the majority of the society to producing it. And this ruling minority, of course, required a state in order to enforce their rule. And so now, with these societies divided into classes, that is, those who produce the surplus and those who claim the ownership over it, a state was absolutely necessary. What Engels described as, quote, a body of armed men, a state, was necessary to maintain the rule of the minority by force. The basic feature of a state is these exclusive bodies of armed individuals who can enforce the dominance of the ruling class, primarily by brute force. Now, how else can an exploited majority be ruled over by a minority of society? So once society is divided into classes, this state becomes absolutely necessary as the instrument in order to maintain the domination of the ruling class. Now, under capitalism, function of the state really is no different. Function of the state from its very inception under capitalism was, as we've discussed, to set up an institution, militaristic, legislative, and executive, to enforce the rule, to enforce the domination in the interests of the capitalist class. Today, Marx might say the state under capitalism plays the same role, however, it's even more advanced. As we've discussed, Madison perhaps summed this up the clearest, where he describes the function of the state as to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. In that sense, the state is the instrument of the protection of the minority ruling class. Now, we'll discuss this in more detail in a moment, but overall, the function of the state, let's say after a proletarian socialist revolution, would be the same. That is, the instrument to maintain the rule of the ruling class, but with a very important difference. What is that difference? Well, in that stage of society, again, after a proletarian revolution, this would be the first time that a state would be the instrument of rule of the majority of the population, of course, as the working class is the vast majority of humanity. But because of this, it will also be the beginning of the end of the state altogether. And so for Marx, the conception of, say, a socialist state, it would begin the process of eliminating all class divisions and inequalities. We'll look at this in more detail, but just to say it now, though, through increased production, that is planned production, increased education, innovation, all of these things would tend towards removing or diminishing social inequalities, and they could start to disappear. As, say, for example, as soon as birth or family status no longer mean anything in terms of your access to what you need to survive, as mere existence in the society tends towards guaranteeing access to whatever that society has to offer, that will be leading in the direction of class division disappearing. Just to say that another way, as there is no distinction in access to the means of subsistence and what we need to survival, that is, there's no difference between who gets what they need, well, then that will be the beginning of the end of class division altogether. The purpose of what Marx calls socialized production would be to meet the needs and wants of the society as a whole. And therefore, as this class division disappears, well then, so does naturally, again for Marx, so does naturally the role of the state. Under socialism, it's an instrument of disappearing class division in general. So in that sense, since the state is the instrument of maintaining class division, as class division disappears, so does the state. So the function in that sense of a socialist or a proletarian state is to actually eliminate the need for the state, to begin the process of its disappearance or withering away, as Engels put it. Now, we don't have time to go over this in any detail, but some past, still present, but past, at least of the time of Marx, disagreements with anarchists or anarchism was around this conception of the state. Initially, many anarchists did not make this connection of the development of the state, that is, as the state as something that comes into existence with the emergence of class division. Instead, anarchism tended to see the state more as a source of exploitation and oppression. It wasn't an understanding of how it emerged in a process of development, how it came to be, what function it plays as it emerges, and how it can change and how it can disappear. It was almost as if it was definitional as to the role that it played, that is, one of oppression, or maintain an instrument to maintain exploitation and oppression. And for this reason, anarchism typically rejected the idea of the state as something that could begin a process of disappearance or withering away, and instead often advocated for the removal of the state in one final act of revolution, as if the revolution could make the state disappear the next day. Of course, Marxists rejected this idea as utopian, since the state is the result of class division, and class division does not just disappear overnight. If it could, well, then the anarchists would be right. So even if anarchists and socialists most often agreed on the ultimate goal of a society without classes, communism, and a society without a state, but they did not share the same analysis of how this society would come to be. But today, perhaps we can say these differences have been further reduced over time, as many, many, many historical examples have further verified the need for some sort of transitional state, some sort of workers' democracy after a revolution, on this process of gradually or eventually removing class divisions and inequality in society. Okay, so that concludes our discussion of the state. Now on to the revolutionary transformation of society. So again, we return to this quote at the beginning of the Communist Manifesto. For Marx, this is very important in terms of understanding not just how societies have changed in the past, but how capitalism contains within the potential for a revolutionary change. So the history of all previously hitherto existing societies, the history of class struggle. So notice right away that this is kind of inaccurate, because not all of history, in fact most of history, was without classes. But in a certain sense, the written history, or that is, once society were divided into classes, yes, absolutely, the history of existing society is the history of class struggles. Goes through freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster, journeyman, a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, and a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending classes. We'll come back to this latter part. For us, the most important part is what it resulted in each time is, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, a class struggle of the oppressor and oppressed, who stood in constant opposition to one another. So for Marx, it is the class struggle that is the instrument or the force within society that contains the potential for a revolution. The class struggle, combined with a particular level of material development of society, that is, the tools, instruments of production have been advanced far enough, all of these things together make a socialist revolution, that is, a revolution to put an end to capitalism, possible. So what to get at here is that, in other words, whether this class struggle is successful in leading to, quote unquote, the revolutionary reconstitution of society, or whether it fails, that is, it leads to the common ruin of the contending classes, depends on a couple different aspects. One, it depends upon what we might call the sort of latent potential of the productive forces. That is, whether they are in fact developed to such an extent that a revolutionary change is possible. And B, it depends on the level of struggle of the oppressed classes. So let's put this in capitalist terms. So what would it mean to say that it depends upon the latent potential of the productive forces of capitalism? Well, what that means is, the first week of capitalism, socialism is impossible, right? Prior to the Industrial Revolution, socialism is impossible. It's only until capitalism begins to become and completed the fully and most dominant mode of society around the globe, where the vast majority or increasing vast majority of society is transformed into the working class, and the degree of development is such that the needs of humanity can be met, and then some, by the current existing tools of society. Now, in Marx's time, you may argue whether that was fully accomplished or not, but certainly that level of development has been surpassed for many decades. And it also depends, of course, on the degree of organization of the working class. So even if the productive forces are sufficiently developed, as we can say clearly they are today, without some sort of revolutionary organizing of the working class to eventually seize those forces of production and reorganize society and control them in their own name in a democratic fashion, well, then, of course, a revolution will remain out of reach. And for decades, we've seen many revolutionary attempts, revolutionary moments, revolutionary periods with revolutionary potential, but they did not yet bring about a successful revolutionary change. And in fact, there will likely be more revolutionary moments that don't lead to such a transformation as well. And so it's important to point out that Marx in no way thought that a socialist revolution was inevitable. He thought that if it did not succeed, it would in fact eventually lead to the ruin of humanity. So the working class has this historic role to play under capitalism. It's positioned in such a way that it does the production of capitalist society, and thereby has access to the means of production because it's doing the work to make society run. It is the numerical majority of society. The productive forces have been developed to such a level that if they were put under a different type of organization for a different purpose, the vast majority of humanity's needs could be met, and so on, and the problems of capitalism can be eliminated. But there's a far cry between that potential and what we would call the actualization of that potential. That is the conscious organization of the working class through class struggle and so on to actually carry out a revolution. So merely having the revolutionary potential, of course, is different from seizing it. Okay, so let's look a little more closely at this revolutionary potential of the working class. So this is a quote from Engels' piece that we had, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Bit of a longer quote, but I like to go through it. So he's describing this process of transformation of society. He says the proletariat seizes the public power being the instruments in society that enable the society to function. And by means of this, it transforms the socialized means of production, slipping from the hands of the bourgeoisie, into public property. So the first act, in a way, of a proletarian revolution is that these means of production, all these instruments, whether they be the transportation industry, let's say, the fossil fuel industry, the shipping industry, whatever the case may be, all the industries of capitalism. When the working class is organized in such a fashion to be able to seize that, important transformation happens. That is, what was once private property under capitalism becomes transformed into the property of the public, because the public, or the mass of the public, has seized upon it. By this act, continuing, the proletariat frees the means of production from the character of capital they have thus far borne, that is, the private character. It's a private property, and gives their socialized character complete freedom to work itself out. Socialized production upon a predetermined plan becomes henceforth possible. What Engels is trying to say is that under capitalism, these means of production, these instruments in the overall organization of production, has two contradictory characters. On one side, it's private, it's privatized, it's privately appropriated, privately owned, but also at the same time contained within it is this socialized production. That is, the masses of society are organized in order to put these things to work and produce them and distribute them and so on. And in a revolutionary transformation, what happens is the removal, the blockage, the removal, transformation of their private character is eliminated, and their socialized character is now free to further develop and work itself out. Okay, continuing. The development of production makes the existence of different classes of society thenceforth an anachronism. Basically, that means from that time forward, after this socialization of the means of production becomes complete, when it is finally seized, it makes the class divisions a kind of thing of the past. Now, not right away, but it becomes a sort of ancient mode of organizing these class divisions. Why? Because now you have the majority in power producing things for their own interest, not for a profit, but for meeting human needs. So what he means by this is, in proportion as anarchy in social production vanishes, the political authority of the state dies out. So here's that idea again. Man, as the last master of his own form of social organizations, becomes at the same time the lord over nature, his own master free. What this means is that capitalism is described as having a kind of anarchy in social production, an unplanned nature. This capitalist produces one type of cell phone, this capitalist produces another. They're competing on the market. They're not producing based upon a desired quantity. They're just producing as much as they can for as cheaply as possible. So you have waste in some areas, overproduction in other areas, underproduction. Anyway, this is described as anarchy by Marx. So as that vanishes, why? Well, because it's no longer production based on individual interest of the owners, but production based on the needs of society as a whole. Well, then the function of the state starts to disappear, because classes start to disappear. More and more the needs start to be met. Inequality starts to disappear, as we mentioned before. We'll get back to this idea of master over their own social organization. It's a bit confusing at this point. I'm going to just pause us on that. I promise we'll return to it later. But continuing the last part, to accomplish this act of universal emancipation is the historical mission of the modern proletariat. That is, it's its mission in the sense that this potential for transformation is sort of waiting to be completed. And to thoroughly comprehend the historical conditions, and this the very nature of this act, to impart to the now oppressed proletarian class a full knowledge of the conditions and of the meaning of the momentous act it is called upon to accomplish. This is the task of the theoretical expression of the proletarian movement. That is, what's the role of communists or socialists or scientific socialists? Is to thoroughly comprehend the historical conditions and this very nature of this necessary act, this need for social revolution, and to try to impart to the working class a full knowledge of the conditions and of the meaning of this important act, right? In other words, to help the proletariat accomplish this goal, better organization, and so on. And so if we dig in deeper, what we see here is this idea that capitalist society rests upon a kind of contradiction between the basis of production and the purpose of production, right? Or we could say it a slightly different way. It's a contradiction between who does the labor and who benefits from the labor. That is a contradiction between individual or private ownership, and not just private ownership, but private ownership and appropriation. That's one side, the purpose of production, right? Versus the base, which is socialized production. So you have private ownership and private appropriation resting upon a base of socialized production. That's this idea of a contradiction. It's a contradiction of what? Of interests, in fact. Individual, private ownership, and appropriation. What does that mean? Simply means, of course, those individual capitalists who appropriate the products of socialized production. That is, they appropriate the products of the masses of workers going to work. What's socialized production? Well, this is in contrast to individualized production. What's individualized production? Well, for example, what we discussed under feudalism. The norm was individualized production, or individualized producers, independent peasants working on the farms, independent craftspeople, cabinet makers, and so on. But of course, under capitalism, as we described, through the process of proletarianization, that norm of individualized production is replaced by socialized production. Now the masses of society reproduce the society on a daily basis, not as individuals, but as a class, as an organized, semi-organized rather, unit. So everything that is produced, moved, sanitized, built, cleaned, serviced, whatever, it's done by this socialized production, the masses of people going to work every day across the world. You could think, maybe perhaps zoom out for a more concrete example of our little spot here around the Bay Area. You can think of maybe the Port of Oakland. You have the Chevron refinery. You have various bus drivers and transportation workers, BART or AC Transit perhaps. You have the truck drivers that go in and out of the port. You might have all the hospital workers. You have the grocery stores. You have those that work at the water treatment, East Bay Mud, gas company, PG&E, communication workers, on and on and on and on, right? Nothing could really function or operate without the work of these hundreds of thousands of people, day in and day out. And so that's the idea of socialized production. And the socialist revolution would mean the beginning of socialized production for the purpose, finally, of now socialized enrichment or socialized benefit, where the purpose of production would be the satisfaction of the needs and wants of those who are doing the production of society as a whole. So no longer would it be socialized production for the purpose of individual benefit, in this case individual profit or individual enrichment, but now this social transformation would mean now, and gradually, and this is important, gradually more and more, it's socialized production for the purpose of society as a whole. Production for need, for wants, for social betterment, again, not for profit. And this is the final quote we'll look at from Manifesto as well. When, in the course of development, class distinctions have disappeared and all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation, that is, post-socialist revolution, the public power will lose its political character. Political power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. This is again the idea of the state, the public power of the state, that is the government as we know it, will lose its ability to be the organized power of one class for oppressing another. Why? If the proletariat during its contest with the bourgeoisie is compelled to organize itself as a class, if by means of a revolution it makes itself the ruling class, and as such sweeps away by force the old conditions of production, then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away the conditions for the existence of class antagonisms and of classes generally, and will thereby have abolished its own supremacy as a class. What's this? Well, this is a repeat of the idea earlier when I was discussing the withering away of the state. If by means of a revolution the working class becomes the ruling class, well then, it's going to sweep away the conditions that have maintained class division, or maintained classes generally. And it will abolish its own supremacy. It will be the end of itself as a ruling class. Why? Not immediately, but if it's carried to fruition, well, because the class divisions will be disappeared. And finally, in the place of old bourgeois society, with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. So this is a commonly quoted idea, but it's usually misunderstood. So the idea here is, finally, when production can return, in fact, to the purpose of, enriching society as a whole, not merely serving the minority class within it. When this happens, we can say the total amount of necessary labor required by individuals can be brought down, reduced, and thereby increasing the freedom of all the members of society. So, how would this be accomplished? Well, we'll go over this in more detail, but basically there are some industries, for example, that we might think of as useless under capitalism, like military production. It's not useless under capitalism. It serves a huge important point under capitalism, but would be deemed useless if capitalism was eliminated and the purpose of society was to meet the needs of the majority. Industries like military production, industries like marketing, as we discussed last time, just there to design to get people to purchase more. Things like the endless patenting of intellectual developments, where one company has to figure out a workaround so that it doesn't violate the patent of another, so that it can compete in the marketplace. Those patents would be a much more collaborative process, because the purpose would be to produce for what humans need. The forced destruction of commodities, when you overproduce and so on. All of these things could be eliminated, and then production can be used to maximize the meeting of human needs and wants instead of profit. Well, what would this mean? It would mean that, things like full employment would no longer be impossible due to the necessity of generating profit. As we see today, the function of employment would be to reduce the amount of work individuals have to do. Why wouldn't you hire more workers or bring on more people to participate, rather, in the production? If there's more people, there's less work. Same way you would approach, today doing something, with a group of friends where you share the work. The bigger the group, the less work you have to do individually, perhaps. And so, in this, as we discussed last week, we would see the idea of alienated labor starting to disappear and be replaced by unalienated labor, which could slowly become the norm. That is, labor that's done under a condition of what we might call free association. Labor that we freely choose to do. This was Marx's idea. This would increase. Maybe at first, there are undesirable types of work, but that could be eliminated, replaced. Perhaps that section could be automated. Then people don't have to do that kind of work. For Marx, he didn't think that all the work we would do, of course, would be freely chosen. The kind of work you do when it doesn't at all feel like work. That's what unalienated work feels like. Of course, there would be work that is still necessary and perhaps undesirable. But again, could that be reduced through either hiring more people so the amount of work on each individual can go down, or by replacing it with better automation or something like that. But overall, the idea would be the end of workers and bosses. Basically only be people deciding how to run their lives. Work could become much more creative and meaningful as people could, work together on projects needed by society or those that they wanted to explore. Even difficult work, again, that people may dislike can be organized to do it with others, right? Could be mechanized to reduce the number of hours required to do it. So the amount of time people would have to spend during doing necessary labor could start to be reduced. So think of it, let's look at this graph. So the idea here is there's a certain quantity of labor that we discussed, a necessary amount of labor required to do something. And currently, that's a certain amount of, let's say, hours of labor. But that could start to be reduced, through innovation and reorganization. And what's replaced with that is more and more freedom for the individual. So for Marx, he makes this relationship between freedom a kind of objective measurement. It's not just this idea of freedom. For Marx, the idea of freedom it's a relationship between necessary labor and leisure. So it takes, let's say, a certain amount of necessary labor to produce whatever society needs. Under capitalism, that necessary labor is dumped upon the fewest number of people possible in order to exploit those individuals, maximally and extract a surplus from them. Under socialism, however, the goal would be, very different in a couple of ways. First, to distribute the necessary labor over the largest number of people as possible would be the goal in order to reduce the number of hours of work required by each person. Again, this is the idea of full employment. But in addition, the role of innovation is important. Oftentimes, you hear sort of knee-jerk reactions to Marx's description of socialism as if, there'd be no role for innovation. To the contrary, there would be an increased role for innovation. So through innovation, efficiency and planning and perhaps better engineering, there's a new goal, which is to reduce the overall necessary amount of labor required to produce things, which is typically the goal of an innovation, in fact. It makes less labor required. Under capitalism, that's a deficit, but here it would be a benefit. A deficit because it means probably laying people off, pushing more people into the surplus population. But as innovation increases, the total necessary labor can continuously decline, and humanity can become, in that sense, increasingly freed from necessary labor in order to live based more and more on the free association, without this alienation of capitalism as we described last time. And so overall, the result of this process is an increase in true freedom. And this is what Marx means when he says, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. The idea here is very clear. It's that people can finally do what they want, but still get what they need. But of course, this is only possible if society is organized on a true democratic foundation, where the purpose of society is not the generation of profit, but is production for the satisfaction of needs and enhancement of life, for all. So there is more we can say about this. Oftentimes we'll say a little bit more in the next couple slides here, but oftentimes socialism is described as sort of a governing structure, a top-down structure, highly centralized, and so on, when in fact it's nothing of the sort. Its main premise is the organization of a system of production. How is a society organized to meet the needs of that society? And for Marx, what socialism is sort of the final removal or destruction of the main obstacles to freedom and social development as well. And so to emphasize what we just went over in another way, capitalism, it puts inherent limits on economic development. Again, it's not just what's profitable are those limits, but also when capital is rooted in current methods of production, there's not a lot of motivation to change those if the system is profitable. Remember, we went over this briefly looking at capitalism functioning as a system of surplus profit. What we saw there was, for example, in the garment industry, there wasn't a lot of incentive to mechanize and further innovate and automate the garment industry precisely because the labor there was so cheap and thereby profit was achievable. Of course, there are methods of mechanizing that and improving it and removing that as necessary labor. Capital may do that only if more profit is to be made or in order to give a concession to a class struggle or whatever the case may be. That is, if it's pushed or forced to, but it has no real motivation to do so without that. So what we see is a lot of these obstacles are rooted into the capitalist system, and they put extreme brakes on development. For example, even when there was another example of this that really shows it is in the case of the Ebola crisis several years ago. People have been talking about more and more the past pandemics or potential pandemics and outbreaks of viruses. And what was exposed then was that there was a vaccine that was in trials, and it made it all the way through the highest level of animal trials, and it was doing fine. But I don't recall who the drug company was, but the drug company at the time decided to put the brakes on the investigation, on the research, because the next stage of the trial was the human trial, which is the most expensive. Their calculus was, given that Ebola is only an outbreak in some of the poorest countries, the profit that could be made from this particular vaccine wouldn't be significant, and so it wasn't worth continuing with the research. So they shelved it on the condition that there was Ebola outbreaks in the wealthier countries, because then they could actually make a profit off of it. Anyway, these are just some examples that show what Marx points to as some of the tendencies in the brakes on developing production, the economy, society towards the direction of human needs being redirected and consistently focused on profit. And this would be the main obstacle that a socialist revolution could remove by putting a society on the firm foundation of human interest. There's some other misconceptions. So it's time to spend a little bit of time clarifying some of the other common misconceptions about socialism briefly. So there have been many inaccurate representations of socialism over the years. Sometimes socialism is used to refer to any sort of state-funded service. Like the fire department is a socialist service, or the library in capitalism is a socialist service. This is a service we pay for through taxation, but that has nothing to do with socialism. Capitalism, as we can see in the course of our everyday lives, has no in principle opposition to using, say, taxation to pay for the costs of some services. There's no rules against this. It's desirable, it's useful in certain circumstances, in different circumstances it's necessary, and so on. Even Adam Smith, of course, as we went over, talks about this. And at the same time, many have collapsed this sort of meaning of socialism into just mere reforms of capitalism. That is, anytime there's a reform of capitalism, it's considered an example of socialism. So if workers get the right to have unemployment compensation, that is a socialist victory, as opposed to, for example, seeing it as a concession given to workers on strike. So there's many of these. And these reforms have often been carried out under the banner of what's sometimes called social democracy, which really proposes to reform some of the more barbaric aspects of capitalism, to try to get government subsidized welfare services through taxation to pay for things, again, like unemployment compensation, healthcare, perhaps education, retirement, sometimes art programs, whatever the case may be. But For Marx, socialism really has nothing in common with these more social democratic kinds of programs. Not because they're not beneficial, of course, but for other reasons. These programs, for example, we might see them in some of the socialist parties of Europe today or in the past, the Labour Party perhaps in Britain. Sometimes we hear it from politicians like Bernie Sanders. They don't stand for socialism in the sense of what we've been discussing, but they really stand for capitalism with a reduced level of misery on the side of the population. And social democracy is basically, in that sense, capitalism with some sort of social welfare programs, but it's not socialism. Most often these concessions, these reforms, are put in place only in response to massive social movements that typically either reach or are potentially reaching a revolutionary direction. So they're actually, in that sense, a method to preserve capitalism, not to remove it. And when the movements end and people think they have won, often the demands of capitalism slowly begin the process of wearing away these gains that the movements have made. So for example, for this reason, for Marx, Bernie Sanders in that sense would not be a scientific socialist or a revolutionary socialist, but somebody we might call a reformist or somebody who proposes reforms. Because, he's been very clear. What he means by socialism is not a revolutionary society democratically run by the working class in the interests of all, but really rather something much more what he has called as Scandinavian societies, which is nothing more than capitalism with a more robust welfare system. Again, the byproduct of class struggle and concessions given to them. So this is kind of important clarification. In addition, perhaps even more of a greater misconception is that socialism is often confused and collapsed with nationalist regimes. For example, like under Castro under Cuba, China under Mao or today, Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh, or of course the Soviet Union under the brutal dictatorship imposed by Stalin. Many of these have called themselves socialist, when in fact they were nationalist regimes which don't have much to do with socialism at all. For Marx, the idea of socialism in one country is a confused and contradictory idea. Socialist society, of course, means an end to capitalism on an international scale. It's an international system. That's very clear with some of the readings we've gone over. It's not socialism in one tiny region of the globe. That would make as much sense as socialism in one's bedroom. There could be no such thing as socialism in one country. With that country, cut off from and defending itself from the capitalist powers of the world. So, just as capitalism is an international system, in order for socialism to thrive, it too is a necessity for it to be an international system. Stamping out every last remnant of sort of the capitalist organization of society. So none of these other regimes are models of socialism in Marx's sense. Just to go on a quick tangent to make the point, in the case of Russia, what happened there is you had a workers' revolution in 1917, but then the working class and the peasantry, the vast majority of the population were totally exhausted after World War I. 2 revolutions, and then a civil war, fighting against invading armies from most of the world's capitalist countries sent either arms or troops to crush the revolution. And most importantly, revolutionary attempts by workers in other countries at that time were defeated. And so that you have this Russian Revolution, this sole case, remained isolated and in a state of misery, really. And this allowed what happened for a bureaucracy around Stalin to take power and keep it really in control for decades to come. And this was in no way a model of socialism coming into being. This was a model of socialism being isolated and unable to come into existence. And as people may well know, Russia under Stalin is an example of a totalitarian regime that actually gave up on the socialist project and instead looked after its own national interests. And we could say similar things for some of the other so-called socialist countries. But in all these cases, really what happened was the abandonment of socialism. At the moment, it was an abandonment of two things. One, abandonment of internationalism and replaced with nationalism. And it was an abandonment of socialism the moment that it wasn't the working class democratically coming to power to run society in its own interests, but it was some other group in society coming to power, carrying out what they perceived as national interests. And it's, instead of aiming at the overthrow of the world international capitalist system, all of them found compromises with the capitalist order and tried to make deals with the imperialist powers that existed at the time. And so it's important in these examples that they represent a very confused and false socialism, one that has nothing in common with Marxism, which understands socialism as, again, international, maximally democratic, run by the majority of the population in their own interests. And it's important to underline this idea of internationalism because, again, it's linked to what we were discussing earlier about the development of the productive forces of society as being the actual pathway to a classless society, and a necessary pathway. So what I mean by that is, what Marx points out is really once these means of production, right, these tools of production and the distribution and all the production of subsistence, in short, when all of the various forces of producing things in society are brought under the conscious planning of society as a whole, only then does the possibility begin to emerge for humanity to once again advance to new levels and enhance the lives of humanity as a whole and not just some segments of them, right? Again, as classless society. Problems that might seem insurmountable under capitalism could begin to be addressed and ultimately eliminated on a global scale, right? So the basic necessities of life could finally start to become guaranteed to all because the motivation of profit is finally removed and needs are placed as the top priority. So the problem today is not, for example, a lack of goods and services. In fact, there's an abundance, right? Abundance of waste even. In a socialist society on an international scale, life would be therefore transformed. And to get rid of capitalism would mean the end of the running of society for profitable means and replacing it with society organized around needs. In fact, if you think about it, Marx points out this is sort of the sole purpose of society to begin with. The reasons humans evolved as a social species is because we can better meet our needs organized together better than we can divided and fragmented and isolated. The purpose of society in that sense is not to benefit only one tiny subgroup, but the population as a whole, of course, thereby on an international scale. And a socialist society would mean that the resources, the land, the machinery, the food, everything humanity relies upon for its survival would no longer be controlled by private interests for private benefits anywhere, but would be the property of society and humanity, in fact, as a whole, and used solely for the benefit of humanity as a whole, and decided upon in a democratic way. So lastly, what we can do is consider some examples of how a socialist society could address current problems that seem like permanent features under capitalism. So let's look at housing and homelessness. So for Marx, the housing problem was a permanent problem of capitalism. Not the problem of individual choices and life choices. The problem, in fact, has nothing to do with supply and demand. There's always enough housing supply to cover the housing demand. Certainly today, the number of vacancies compared to the number of people who are unhoused is astronomical. Some data was released in 2016 that about 6 to 7 vacant units for every single homeless person in the United States. So the real problem is about profitability and in fact the very purpose of housing under capitalism. So even this data of vacant units that I've seen in 2014, they had some details where it said around 18.6 million vacant homes in the U.S., while you had an average of about 600,000 Americans experiencing homelessness on any given night. In reality, this figure is not even close to what's available, right? It excludes empty apartments, and it excludes empty hotel rooms, excludes empty motel rooms. And this is because under capitalism, it's not profitable to provide people with housing if they can't afford it. It's a commodity, just like anything else that can be sold for a profit. And if you start to give it away, well, then you undermine the entire market. And increasingly, people can't afford it, as we've seen. But of course, under socialism, what would housing be? Housing would be having a place to live, which is a social problem. It's not an individual problem. It's the responsibility of the whole of society to provide its population with its needs. And so with relative ease, of course, already with the given vacancies, housing could be solved, at least in the U.S., of course, very easily. Out of all of the vacancies we see, all of these can be used to provide people with living spaces. We even saw this for a brief moment in some cities under the pandemic, where some homeless populations were granted temporary stay in empty hotel rooms. Again, this was because nobody was going to hotel rooms, and they were trying to reduce the spread. But of course, the same logic could apply. Not under capitalism, of course, but under a different society. We would see an end to tent cities and this sort of thing, because the real housing problems, of course, in the poorest parts of the world, could also be, again, to be addressed in a similar fashion. Now, unemployment is probably the most important example. Again, we've discussed the social surplus population, which, to repeat, unemployment it's not only necessary, but in fact is beneficial to the capitalists. Again, it pits workers against each other in their desperate hunt for a job. It can increase, therefore, the rate of exploitation or the quantity of work extracted or the pay given for it. And of course, under a social society run by and for the population as a whole, the very purpose of work would no longer, as we've explained, be to exploit people and make a profit, but would be to produce what society needs. This would mean that labor was understood more as a necessary part of a functioning society, more like a necessary task that has to be performed for society to function, as opposed to your only ticket to survival. And so the idea of unemployment would then completely change and no longer make any sense, really. The more people who could do the work to get the necessary labor of society completed, the better, because that would mean it would get done faster and each worker would have less to do. And it would be the exact opposite of what we see today, where the fewer workers, the better, because the more profits can be made. So for Marx, what we see is that it could even be that it's the possibility that it's that necessary labor graph, the possibility that the amount of hours of labor for each person could start to go way down. Could almost like an asymptote approach zero as the quantity of necessary labor placed upon the individual can be reduced in two forms. One, by more laborers. Two, by innovation. So maybe at first we have 10 hours a week and then 8, until eventually we might be capable of only having to spend a couple hours per week to meet humanity's basic needs. And finally, this would truly be the basis where we'd not just be living just to kind of go to work, but we'd be doing a little bit of work so we can actually spend our time living. We can actually live freely. Who knows what you do at that point? It's purely up to our imagination what we would do. It's science fiction at this point. How many of us would be musicians or writers or poets or artists or scientists or all of these things on Wednesday and some other things on another day and more, if we actually had the time to explore our talents and actually learn new ones. I like to think that I'd be some sort of marine biologist digging deep down into the ocean, or studying astrophysics or something if I really had the time. Imagine what your lives could be like once that ever-present pressure of time to get all the things done that you never have enough time to do was finally removed, and you could live your lives to the fullest. But of course, as it is now, most people in the world will never know how great they are at playing a piano, or whether they can write a novel or be an artist or a philosopher, because they'll never even get the chance to try. It's like all those unfulfilled dreams so many people have, those projects, you never get time to get around to. Those ideas that come to you in the shower, or perhaps those vacations you're never able to take. This happens. You even see this kind of crushing of hopes and dreams happen early on sometimes in children in education. And you see a similar shift happens in kids when their creative and curiosity and excitement to learn starts to dissipate by the time they're teenagers. When you're kids, you're kind of often interested in everything. You want to play this sport, that sport, try this, try that, try this, try that, do whatever you can. And that kind of self-directed curiosity is, normal and healthy, but it's a problem for it to go away as we grow up, of course, and we're forced to adapt to the limited choices we see in front of us under capitalism. And this is what Marx's idea, each according to their abilities. But with more free time and access to resources, we can see perhaps that curiosity and that interest could be rejuvenated and fulfilled and consistently nourished. And this brings up another point about education. So under capitalism, right now, basically 1 to 2% of the world's population has a bachelor's degree, any kind of real college education. Why? Well, it's not complicated, because under capitalism, the purpose of education is not really to reach your limitless potential, but it's what's called part of capitalist reproduction. The function of education is really to meet the needs of the capitalist system and reproduce the kind of workers and training that capitalism needs. And that thereby shapes the organization of education. For most countries, the purpose of mass education is simply to train a workforce for jobs that exist. Under capitalism, it's a waste of time and money to educate people to do jobs that don't require an advanced education. The vast majority of jobs that are required don't require college. Hence, the vast majority of people in the world don't have a college education. College education is reserved for those who can be, perhaps the managers, the accountants, the researchers, the programmers, those necessary jobs that require a college education. But most people, of course, as I said, don't need that. Not for the kinds of jobs that most people find. But again, real quickly, we can see a shift under a socialist society. When you organize the society, for the interest of a whole, education would just be an inherent part of a successful society. The highest quality of education for all would be the goal without any sort of distinction. And just imagine the kind of, if the majority of the population actually had the ability to unleash that potential by receiving, a highly advanced education beyond what we consider today, at that point, it raises questions about what humanity could be capable of. Imagine if that 1 to 2% shifted to 10, 20, 30, 40, or so on. What would humans be capable of if the vast majority of humanity received the highest education possible? Okay, and the last point to consider this distinction is we can look at capitalism and sort of waste, or just complete wasted overproduction and waste. So, Marx points out that the capitalist system is built upon a continuous overproduction and waste. It's just part of its production cycle. For example, say the U.S., it's estimated 40% of produced edible food is wasted every year. This was completely highlighted this last year during the pandemic. Most recently, there were reports of farms destroying crops because they couldn't sell them in time because of certain industries, whether it was the travel industry or the shipping cruise line industry, whatever the case may be. They produced all this food, but there wasn't a way to sell it at a profit anymore, so they just destroyed it on their farms. Even though there was, lines for the food bank that stretched miles long, and people couldn't afford it, couldn't afford the food, so they had to destroy it. Similarly, this happens, on a regular basis. If you ever worked in the grocery industry, at the end of the day, there's various foods that are either cut open, the package is cut open, or it didn't sell in time, so it expired, or maybe it's edible, but they can't sell it for liability issues, so they have to destroy it. Sometimes when they put it in the trash bins and there's a real crisis of hunger or poverty in the area, you start to get people who go to those trash bins, so then they start to lock them and sometimes put some sort of chemical on them to deter people. Anyway, the normal process of capitalist production is on the scale of the US, but also the world. It's roughly 40% of completely edible food is produced. And it's very similar in many industries. Take the consumer electronics industry. Capitalism relies upon what they call planned obsolescence. It's not very complicated. It's just the idea of building into your production, the idea of making it obsolete in a certain amount of time. Perhaps the cell phone's battery wears out, but you can't really just replace the batteries. You have to buy the whole new part. Whatever the case may be. This is the production of things that are designed in order to be replaced precisely because it's more profitable than producing one that lasts too long. Whether it's a new cell phone, a computer, they continuously come out with new modifications and to correct the errors that were built into the previous one. And capitalism constantly requires this production of new commodities, because if things were built to last, then they'd have nothing or less and less to sell and less profit. But durability, of course, that is the removal of obsolescence, would be an inherent part of socialist production. Why? Because there's an immediate benefit to durable production. It would mean less work would have to be done. You don't have to produce more things, i.e. less work. And people can, again, spend their time doing more than just working. So if the purpose of production was to meet social needs, then production could be planned and waste thereby could be eliminated. And these intentional waste or intentional redundancies could also be eliminated. And innovation could finally be freed from the traps of profit, as we described, and the need to constantly expand just to generate more profit. And innovation could be based on reducing socially necessary labor and improving quality of life. Okay, so to conclude, for Marx, in summary, capitalism at his time and continuing today has what he describes as sort of outlived its usefulness. It was useful. It's very important. Capitalist system had rapidly transformed society and our lives and created enormous potential compared to the feudal system that it replaced. But that potential was also being limited and squandered, and of course continued to rest on mass exploitation and begun to depend on massive wars of domination and destruction. This is only more true today. But at the same time, capitalism simultaneously has created an international working class that holds an incredible power to transform society. The legitimate potential for this revolutionary change rests upon the international working class, that is the class that currently produces all of society's products, but currently makes no decisions about what happens to that product, how it is produced, which products are produced, why it is produced, who benefits from its production, and so on. And finally, for Marx, the only way for the international working class to successfully carry out this task, without any predetermined guarantee of success, is through the construction of revolutionary organizations of organized workers in the class struggle to lead their own struggles, to make their own decisions, and to increasingly become self-reliant and no longer subordinate to the capitalist class and the state that is used to maintain its rule. By self-reliant, that is not move into the countryside and go off the grid, but self-reliant, that is to rely upon their own forms of organizing and skills to produce what society needs by way of seizing the means of production of capitalism. And the outcome, right? Which outcome that we began, whether it be common ruin or whether it be a revolutionary reconstitution, which pathway, which one happens, depends upon the choices of individuals, in fact, today. Whether they choose to be on the side of the revolution or on the side of the maintenance or conservation of capitalism. In addition, one update, if you will, Marx does talk about this to an interesting degree, but not to the same level of awareness that we might be able to say today, is about climate disruption. One difference today is that in addition to the degeneration that capitalism imposes on the world's population that Marx writes about extensively, there's a new challenge where it's continued destruction of the environment for reliance upon fossil fuels, overproduction, deforestation, the plastics industry, the pharmaceutical industry, which relies on fossil fuels. Anyway, so much of the capitalist global economic system is rooted and enmeshed in these greenhouse gassing producing fossil fuels that, just this year we saw the highest number of concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere ever. And there's no path of seriousness for them to reduce this because it's too profitable and they have a lot of inertia in changing this. So we might say that this question of common ruin or revolutionary reconstitution could be put a little more sharply given the climate destruction we know about today. So climate change and the destruction of the environment, we could say, have become part of the basic features of capitalism. And so we might even say now today it's no longer simply revolutionary reconstitution of society or common ruin of the contending classes. Marx, if we were around, might even say what we face is revolution or extinction, because that's the severity of continuing with capitalism on its course to environmental destruction. Anyway, those are the things for you to consider. That concludes our unit for Marx. Next, we'll pick up the question of fascism. Not so much the idea of the fascists themselves, but what produces fascism? Where does it come from? What sort of political role does it actually play, and whose interests are being served by this?